A grand carriage broke its axle at the Duke's gate in the pouring rain. The lady inside owned a silk gown worth more than a servant earned in a year. But the moment she stepped into the storm, she did the one thing no one expected, and the man watching from the mud was not who she thought he was. The Duke of Wexley had worn many fine coats in his life, yet on that grey afternoon he stood in the mud of his own courtyard wearing the plain leather jerkin of a stable hand, and not a single soul knew his name. They called him Thomas. He had given himself the name 3 weeks ago, the morning he decided he was done with it all. Done with the painted ladies who fluttered their fans at his fortune. Done with the mothers who pushed their daughters toward him like cattle at a fair. And most of all, done with the way every last one of them looked straight through his sister Mary, as though she were a piece of furniture in the corner of the room. So Arthur had traded his silk for leather, smeared honest dirt across his jaw, and slipped into the role of a servant on his own estate. If a woman could not be kind when there was nothing to gain, then she was no wife for him, and no sister for Mary. He had not expected the storm. The rain came down in grey sheets, hammering the cobblestones and turning the courtyard into a churning soup of mud. Arthur pulled his cap lower and squinted toward the gates, where a grand black carriage came rattling up the lane far too fast for the weather. He saw it before the driver did. The front wheel struck a hidden rut, there was a sharp crack like a snapping bone, and the whole carriage lurched hard to one side as the axle gave way. The horses screamed, the driver shouted, and Arthur was already running. By the time he reached them, the carriage door had burst open, and a young woman was stepping down into the downpour. She wore a traveling gown of pale blue silk, the sort that cost more than most men earned in a year, and the rain was ruining it by the second. Arthur braced himself, certain of what came next. He had seen it 100 times. She would shriek about her dress. She would demand someone fetch her a cloak, an umbrella, a dry room, a miracle. Instead, she did something he had never once seen a lady of her standing do. She turned her back on her own carriage and ran toward the gardens. Arthur followed her gaze, and his stomach dropped. There, near the rose hedges, stood a slim figure in a grey shawl, turning in slow and frightened circles. Mary. His sister had gone walking before the storm broke, the way she often did, counting her steps along the gravel paths she knew by heart. But the rain had come so suddenly that it had stolen the sounds she used to find her way, and now she stood lost and soaked through, one hand reaching for a hedge that was not there. "Stay still, my dear, I am coming to you," the young woman called out, her voice steady and warm despite the chaos. She reached Mary in a dozen quick strides and lifted her own umbrella, the only shelter she had, and held it not over herself, but over the trembling girl. The rain poured down the lady's back. Her fine silk gown clung to her shoulders, soaked and ruined, and she did not so much as glance at it. "There now," she said gently. "You are safe. I have you." Arthur slowed to a halt a few paces away, the rain dripping from the brim of his cap, and he simply watched. The young woman drew a handkerchief from her sleeve, a small square of white linen, and began to wipe the rain from Mary's face with the tenderness of a sister. She did not flinch at Mary's clouded, sightless eyes. She did not speak to her slowly or loudly. She spoke to her as an equal, asking her name, telling her about the broken carriage, making a soft joke about the weather that drew a startled little laugh from Mary's lips. Something in Arthur's chest, something that had been locked shut and bolted for a very long time, gave a quiet and dangerous turn. The driver's voice cut through the rain.
"Lady Clara, the axle's gone clean through. I cannot move her an inch."
Clara. So that was her name. Arthur shook himself and remembered who he was meant to be. He stepped forward, ducking his head in the rough manner of a servant, and put his shoulder against the leaning carriage to steady it before it could topple into the mud entirely.
"I have it, miss,"
he said, roughening his fine voice into something plainer.
You'd best get the young lady indoors. There's a fire in the great hall.
Clara looked at him then, truly looked, for the first time. Rain ran down her face, and her dark hair had come loose from its pins, and yet she smiled at him, with a warmth that struck him like sunlight through cloud.
"Thank you,"
she said.
"You are very kind. What is your name?" "Thomas, miss,"
he answered, and was surprised at how much it cost him to lie to her.
"Just Thomas, the stable hand."
"Well, Thomas," she said, already turning to guide Mary gently toward the house, one arm around the girl's shoulders.
"I am very glad you were here."
Arthur stood in the pouring rain, holding up the broken weight of the carriage, and watched the two of them walk away together through the mud and the storm. He had come home to test the women of England, to weed out the false from the true, certain it would take him months to find a single honest heart. He had not expected to find one before the day was even done, and he most certainly had not expected that the moment he learned her name, he would already be afraid of losing her. The great hall of Wexley had stood for 300 years, and Arthur had never once thought of it as warm until that night. He came in through the servants' passage with an armful of split oak, his leather jerkin still damp from the storm, and found the room already softened by firelight. The rain drummed steadily against the tall windows. The driver had been sent to the stables to rest, the broken carriage hauled under cover, and the two stranded travellers settled by the hearth in borrowed dry shawls, while the household saw to their comfort. Arthur knelt at the great fireplace and began to feed the wood to the flames, keeping his head low and his movements rough, the very picture of a servant about his work. From this corner he could watch without being watched. It was a trick he had learned quickly in his new life, and it shamed him a little how useful he found it. Mary sat in the high-backed chair nearest the fire, her hands folded in her lap, her face turned toward the warmth. Clara sat beside her on a low stool, close enough that their knees nearly touched, and she was talking in that same gentle voice Arthur had heard in the courtyard.
"Now then,"
Clara was saying,
"shall I tell you what this room looks like? For I think it is the grandest I have ever stepped foot in, and it would be a great pity for you to miss it."
Mary's face brightened.
"Oh, would you? Mrs. Pennywick describes things to me, but she only ever says a thing is large or small, and never anything in between."
Clara laughed softly.
"Then Mrs. Pennywick has no eye for poetry. Close your eyes, though I suppose that makes little difference for you, and listen. The ceiling is so high above us that the firelight cannot reach it, so it simply melts away into shadow, like the inside of a great cathedral. There are wooden beams up there, dark as treacle, and I should not be surprised if there were owls nesting in them."
Mary giggled.
"Owls? In the house?" "In a house this old, anything is possible."
Clara leaned closer.
"The fire before us is enormous. You can feel that, can you not? It is the size of a doorway, and the flames are the color of marigolds and copper, and they snap and pop because the oak is still a little green. Smell that? That sharp, clean smell, like a forest in winter. That is the pine sap burning."
Arthur went very still over the firewood. He had grown up in this hall. He had run its length as a boy and been scolded for it. He had stood in it as a man to receive guests he despised and to bury a father he had loved. He thought he knew every stone of it. And yet, listening to Clara describe the smell of the pine and the color of the flame, he felt as though he were seeing the room for the very first time, through eyes that were not his own.
"And the windows," Clara went on, "are tall as 10 men, with little diamonds of glass set in lead. The rain is running down them now in long silver lines, and behind the glass the whole world has gone dark and wild. But in here, it is gold and quiet and safe. That is the best part, I think. The safe part."
Mary reached out and found Clara's hand and held it. "You make it sound like a place in a story," she said quietly. "Thank you. I can see all of it. Truly I can." For a long moment, Clara said nothing. She only squeezed the girl's hand, and Arthur, watching from the shadows, saw something glisten at the corner of the lady's eye that had nothing to do with the rain. He bent his head back to the fire before either of them could notice him watching. His throat had gone tight and strange. In all his years of being paraded before the daughters of dukes and earls, not one of them had ever spoken to Mary the way one speaks to a friend. They had pitied her, or ignored her, or worse, praised her as though her every small accomplishment were a miracle. None of them had simply handed her the world in words and let her hold it. A bell rang somewhere deep in the house, and Arthur knew it was meant for him. There was ducal business that did not stop merely because its master had gone wandering in disguise. Letters from the magistrate and the steward's accounts, all of it waiting in the small stone room above the stables where he kept his true self hidden. He rose, gathered the empty wood sling, and made for the passage. As he passed the hearth, he heard Clara say, "And now I shall describe to you the kind young man who steadied our carriage in the rain, for I do not think you have met him properly." Arthur froze with his hand on the door. "He is tall," Clara said thoughtfully, "and broad through the shoulders, the way men are who do honest work. But there is something odd about him, Mary. When he spoke to me, he held his chin up, like a man who is used to being listened to. A strange thing in a stable hand. I cannot quite make sense of it." Arthur slipped through the door before she could say another word, his heart hammering against his ribs. He climbed the cold stone steps to his hidden room, 2 at a time, lit a single candle, and spread the steward's papers before him. But the figures swam meaningless on the page. He could not read a line of them. He sat there in the flickering dark, a duke pretending to be a servant, and he understood with a sinking certainty that the cleverest woman he had ever met had begun, after only a single afternoon, to see straight through him. The storm had blown itself out in the night, and the morning came up clean and golden over the estate, every leaf and petal hung with droplets that caught the early sun. Arthur was already in the rose garden when they came, kneeling among the hedges with a pair of shears, trimming back the storm-broken branches. It was honest work and useful, and it gave him a fine excuse to keep close. He had told himself it was only to watch over Mary. He was no longer entirely sure that was true. He heard them before he saw them, Clara's voice and Mary's laughter drifting down the gravel path. The two had risen early, it seemed, while the rest of the household still slept. Arthur sank a little lower behind the hedge and kept his shears moving. "Now," Clara was saying, "your brother's gardener has done a marvelous thing here, for he has planted 3 different kinds of rose along this one walk, and not a one of them looks the same."
"But you, my dear, are going to learn to tell them apart without ever once seeing them."
"I cannot think how," Mary said. "A rose is a rose." "A rose is most certainly not a rose." Clara took the girl's hand and guided it slowly toward the first bush. "Here, do not grab at it. Feel along the stem, gently, the way you would stroke a cat. Tell me about the thorns." Mary's fingers crept along the branch. "They are small," she said after a moment. "Small and close together, like a cat's teeth, and there are ever so many of them." "Just so. That is the little white rambling rose, and it climbs all over everything like a naughty child, so it needs a great many thorns to hold on with. Now come this way." Arthur watched, unmoving, as Clara led his sister to the next bush. He had walked this path 1,000 times and never once noticed that the roses had different thorns. He had never noticed the roses at all, if he were honest, beyond a vague sense that they were red and that his mother had loved them. "These thorns are different," Mary said, wonder creeping into her voice.
Big, far apart, curved like a hawk's claw, and the stem is thick.
That is the old damask rose, the grandmother of the whole garden. She is proud, and she keeps her distance, so she grows but a few thorns, but each one is wickedly sharp. And the petals. Clara guided Mary's fingertips to a half-open bloom. Feel how thick they are, like the finest velvet. The white rambler has petals thin as paper, but the damask wears velvet, for she is a great lady and dresses the part. Mary laughed with pure delight, her clouded eyes shining.
I can see them. Truly, I can see them now.
There, now you shall never again be lost in a garden, for your hands have learned to read it. Clara reached to part the leaves so Mary might find the third bush. And this last one is my own favorite, the cabbage rose, all soft and round and full like... She gave a small, sharp gasp. Arthur was on his feet before he knew he had moved. A bright bead of blood had welled up on the tip of Clara's finger where a hidden thorn had caught her. For one breath, he saw the cleverness drop from her face and pure pain take its place. Then Mary's hand tightened on hers.
Clara, what is it? Are you hurt? Oh, it was the thorns. I made you reach into them.
And Arthur watched the lady do a remarkable thing. She laughed. It was light and easy and entirely false, and only a man watching very closely would have seen the way she pressed her thumb hard against the wound to stop it.
Goodness, no,
Clara said brightly.
I have only gone and dropped my glove in the wet grass, clumsy creature that I am. There it is. No harm done at all, my dear, save to my dignity.
Mary's worried face smoothed at once into a smile.
You are forever dropping things. I am the clumsiest woman in 3 counties. It is a wonder I am let out of doors.
Clara kept her voice merry, but Arthur saw the blood still beating on her finger, saw her hide her hand carefully in the folds of her skirt so the girl would never know. She had taken the pain and the blame upon herself, swift and sure, rather than let Mary carry a single moment of guilt. Arthur stepped out from behind the hedge. He had a clean square of linen in his hand, the cloth he used to wipe down the tools, but freshly laundered and white. He crossed the gravel in 3 strides and held it out to her without a word. Clara looked up, startled. Their eyes met. She knew, in that instant, that he had seen the whole of it, the thorn and the blood and the kind lie, and that he had said nothing because he understood exactly why she had told it. A slow understanding passed between them, deeper than any words.
Thank you, Thomas,
she said quietly, taking the linen and wrapping her finger. Her merry mask was gone now, and what lay beneath it was something gentler and more real.
You see a great deal, do you not, for a man who keeps so quiet?
A man learns more by his eyes than his tongue, miss, Arthur answered. Clara studied him a moment longer than was proper.
Yes, she said slowly, I begin to think he does.
And Arthur, who had come home to test the hearts of strangers, turned back to his hedges with the uneasy feeling that he was the one being weighed. The autumn festival came to the village but once a year, and by midday the narrow lanes were a riot of color and noise that spilled all the way down to the river. Clara had asked, the evening before, whether Mary might be taken to see it. Mrs. Pennywick had fussed and worried, but Clara had said simply that a girl who could read a garden with her hands ought to be let loose among the music and the spice and the laughter, and that had settled the matter. So it was that Arthur found himself perched on the bench of a plain wooden wagon, the reins of a steady old cob in his hands, driving the 2 of them the 3 miles into the village. He had chosen the wagon himself, claiming the fine carriages were all in want of repair. The truth was that a stable hand had no business driving a lady about in a ducal coach, and he was not yet ready to be caught. Mary sat between them, her face lifted to the breeze, and as the village came into earshot, she gripped Clara's arm in excitement.
Oh, I can hear a fiddle and a drum, and someone is roasting chestnuts. I can smell them from here.
You can smell them because you have a far better nose than I, Clara said. Thomas, can you find us somewhere to leave the wagon? I should like to walk her through it all. Arthur drew the cob to a halt at the edge of the green and helped them both down. He meant to stay with the wagon as a servant ought, but Clara looked back at him over her shoulder. Come along, Thomas. 3 sets of eyes are better than 2 in a crowd this thick, and I'll wager yours miss very little. It was not a request he could easily refuse, and in truth, he did not wish to. The market was a glorious chaos. Stalls crowded both sides of the lane, draped in autumn leaves and strung with paper lanterns waiting for dusk. There were baskets of russet apples and golden pears, wheels of cheese, ribbons fluttering on poles, a man selling hot spiced cider from a great steaming barrel. A fiddler stood upon an upturned crate, sawing out a country reel while children danced in the mud around his feet. Clara described it all to Mary as they went, her voice never pausing, painting the colors and the costumes and the dancing children, and Mary walked through it transformed, laughing at every new sound, reaching out to touch a hanging ribbon, lifting an apple to breathe in its scent before she ate it. Arthur walked a half-step behind, watching the crowd more than the stalls. He had spent his life among grand things, yet he could not remember the last time he had felt so simply, plainly content as he did following these 2 through the press of common folk, with no one bowing, no one scraping, no one wanting a single thing from him. It was the sound that warned him first. A shout, a clatter, the frightened whinny of a horse somewhere up the hill where the lane sloped down toward the green. Arthur turned. A merchant's barrow, heaped high with apples and pumpkins, stood at the top of the slope where its owner had set it while he haggled. Some careless soul had knocked the wooden block from beneath its wheel, and now the whole laden cart was rolling, slowly at first, and then faster, straight down the crowded lane. People scattered before it with cries of alarm, but Mary stood directly in its path, frozen by the sudden noise, unable to see the thing that bore down upon her. "Mary!" Arthur shouted, already lunging, but he was 3 bodies back in the crowd, and a market stall stood between them. Clara did not shout. Clara moved. She crossed the space in a single sweep, seized Mary by both shoulders, and threw the girl bodily sideways toward the safety of their own wagon. The cart's wooden shaft caught Clara hard across the shoulder as she turned, spinning her about, and she stumbled and went down hard upon one knee in the mud as the runaway barrow crashed past and smashed itself to splinters against a stone trough below. For one terrible moment, everything was apples and screaming and dust. Then Arthur was through the crowd and on his knees beside her. Mary clung safe to the wagon wheel, shaken but whole, calling Clara's name in fright. "I am here, my dear. I am quite all right," Clara called back at once, though her voice shook and her face had gone white. "Not a scratch on me. Mary, are you hurt? Tell me you are not hurt." I am well, but you went down. I heard you fall." "I tripped over my own clumsy feet, that is all." Clara was already trying to rise, pressing one hand hard to her bruised shoulder, hiding the worst of it from the girl out of pure habit. Arthur caught her elbow and steadied her, and for the second time in 2 days, he found himself looking into her eyes from very close, and finding far more there than he had any right to. "You might have been crushed," he said, low and rough, and there was a tremor in his fine, false servant's voice that he could not quite master. "Why did you not save yourself? You had the time. You chose her over your own neck without a thought." Clara looked at him steadily, one hand still cradling her shoulder, the color slowly returning to her cheeks. "Of course I did," she said simply, as though he had asked her why the sun rose. "What kind of person stops to think about a thing like that?" And Arthur, kneeling in the festival mud with the broken apples rolling all about them, had no answer at all. Arthur got them away from the crowd as quickly as he could. The festival had become a swarm of gawkers and well-meaning busybodies, and Clara was holding her composure together with sheer will, smiling and waving off concern so that Mary would not worry. But Arthur had seen the white of her face and the careful way she held her arm, and he knew she needed somewhere quiet. He drove the wagon down a narrow turning behind the village bakery, a shaded little alley where the warm smell of bread drifted from an open window and the noise of the market faded to a distant hum. He helped Mary down first and settled her on an upturned crate, then turned to Clara. "Let me see your shoulder, miss." "It is nothing," Clara began. "It is not nothing. You took a barrow shaft across it at a run." He kept his voice gentle, but left no room for argument. "Mary, your friend has a bruise the size of a dinner plate coming up, and she has been telling fibs about it since the market. Will you help me make her sit still?" Mary's worried face turned toward them. "I knew it. I heard you fall, Clara. I heard it. You have been lying to me this whole while." "Only a small lie," Clara admitted, and a little of her real weariness showed at last. "And only because I did not wish you frightened." "Well, I am frightened now, so you may as well let Thomas tend to you." Caught between them, Clara gave a tired laugh and surrendered. She eased herself down onto a second crate and let her shawl slip from her shoulder. The skin beneath was already darkening, an ugly bloom of purple spreading across the curve of it, and there was a long scrape where the rough wood had dragged. Arthur drew a bucket of clean water from the bakery's well and tore a fresh strip from his own linen shirt. He knelt before her and began, very carefully, to clean the scrape. He had never tended a wound in his life. A duke did not. There were always others to do such things, surgeons and servants and nurses, yet his hands moved with a steady, practiced certainty as he cleaned the dirt away and pressed the cool cloth to the bruise. And he was concentrating so fiercely on not hurting her that he forgot, entirely, to be a stable hand. He forgot to roughen his voice. He forgot to keep his eyes down and his manner humble. He gave quiet, clear instructions to Mary about wetting the cloth, the unmistakable tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed at once, and he held Clara's injured arm with the easy command of someone who had never in his life doubted his own authority over a situation. And Clara, sitting very still beneath his hands, watched his face the whole time. She watched the way he frowned in concentration. She watched the careful, educated turn of his wrist as he wrung out the cloth. She looked at the hand that held her arm and saw that beneath the dirt rubbed across the knuckles, the skin was smooth, the nails clean and neatly trimmed, the palm without a single callus that years of hauling firewood and mucking stables ought to have carved into it. She said nothing, but something behind her eyes was working very quickly. "There," Arthur said at last, tying off the cloth as a binding. "It will ache for a week and look a fright for 2, but nothing is broken. You were fortunate." "Fortune had little to do with it, I think," Clara said softly. "You were very quick and very sure of yourself for a man who tends horses." Arthur went still. The alley seemed suddenly very quiet. "A man learns to be quick around horses, miss," he said, and even to his own ears the answer sounded thin. Clara tilted her head, studying him with those clever, dark eyes, the way she had studied the roses, reading him by touch and texture as surely as she had taught Mary to read the garden. "And does a man learn, around horses, to speak as you spoke just now? You gave orders like a captain on a deck. You did not ask me, you told me. And you held my arm as though it had never once occurred to you that I might refuse." "I beg your pardon if I was too forward." "You were not too forward. That is precisely the thing." She leaned a little closer, lowering her voice so Mary, humming softly to herself a few feet away, would not hear. "I have spent my whole life among great men, Thomas. My father dined with earls.
I know the way a man carries himself when he has spent his life being listened to. It sits in the shoulders, it sits in the spine, and it sits in you, plain as a brand, however much dirt you rub upon your face." For a long moment Arthur knelt there, and the lie he had worn so easily for 3 weeks felt suddenly as heavy as a stone about his neck. He could have laughed it off. He could have spun some tale of a soldier father, a fall from grace, a gentleman's son ruined and brought low. The story would have held. She wanted it to hold, he could see that much, for she liked the stable hand and did not wish him to be anything but what he claimed. But he looked into her face, open and honest and waiting, and he found he could not bring himself to add a single fresh lie to the one already stretched between them. So he said nothing at all, and his silence, to a woman as clever as Clara, said a very great deal. She sat back slowly, her rapt shoulder forgotten, and a strange new wariness crept into her expression, the look of someone who has begun to suspect that the ground beneath her feet is not at all what she believed it to be. "Who are you?" she asked quietly. "Truly?" Arthur had not answered her question. He could not. Before the silence in the alley could stretch any thinner, Mary had asked to go home, tired and shaken from the fright, and the moment had passed like a held breath let slowly out. They had driven back to the estate in a quiet that was full of unspoken things. The next afternoon brought a visitor.
Arthur was crossing the front hall with a tray of refreshments, playing the dutiful servant, when the great doors swung open without so much as a knock, and Lord Harrington swept in upon a gust of his own importance. Arthur knew him at once and stopped dead behind a pillar. Harrington owned the lands that bordered Wexley to the east, a stout, florid man with a high opinion of himself and a long-standing wish to redraw the property line through the old water meadow in his own favor. He had been pestering the estate's steward about it for a year. He had clearly come expecting to bully his way to a deal, and he had clearly come expecting to find the Duke at home. What he found instead was Clara and Mary taking tea in the drawing-room. "Where is Wexley?" Harrington demanded of the room at large, peeling off his gloves. "I was told he was in residence. I have driven a great distance, and I do not care to be kept waiting." "The Duke is away on business, my lord," Clara said smoothly, rising to greet him with perfect courtesy. "I am Lady Clara Ashworth, a guest of the house. May I offer you some tea while you wait?" Harrington looked her over, looked past her to where Mary sat by the window, and his lip curled in something close to distaste. "Ashworth. I know the name. Minor family. And who is this?" He gestured at Mary without lowering his voice. "Is the girl simple? She has not so much as looked at me since I came in." Arthur's grip tightened on the silver tray until his knuckles ached. "My name is Mary, my lord," Mary said quietly, her chin lifting. "I am the Duke's sister, and I have not looked at you because I am blind, not because I am rude, though I begin to wonder which of us wants for manners." Harrington gave a short, ugly laugh. "Blind? Good heavens! Well, no matter. You need not trouble yourself with the conversation then. It is well beyond you. I shall speak with the lady, if she has wit enough to follow." He turned his back on Mary entirely and dropped himself into the best chair. "Now, the water meadow. Wexley's father always meant for that boundary to run along the elms. Everyone knows it, and I mean to have the matter set right while the young Duke is too green to argue. I'll need only a signature." From his place behind the pillar, Arthur went very still. He very nearly stepped forward then and there, ready to throw off the whole disguise rather than let the man speak so to his sister. But Clara was already rising to her full height, and something in the set of her jaw made him hold his place. "That is curious, my lord," Clara said, and her voice had changed. The warmth was still there, but beneath it now ran a thread of steel.
for I happened to read the original Wexley land grant only last spring, the one drawn up in the old king's time. The boundary it names is the river itself, not the elms. The elms were planted a full 60 years after the grant was sealed. A clever choice, planting them just shy of the true line. But trees, my lord, however old they grow, cannot move a boundary that was written into law before their first seed was sown. Harrington's florid face began to redden. "Now see here!" "And I should add," Clara went on, as pleasantly as if she were discussing the weather, "that a boundary fixed by royal grant cannot be altered by a private signature at all, not the Duke's, not anyone's. It would want a petition to the courts, witnesses, surveyors, and a great deal of money, with very little hope of success, since the grant is as plain as a church bell. So, you see, you have driven a great distance for nothing. Unless, of course, you came simply to take tea, in which case you are most welcome, though I confess your manners want a little polishing before I should care to pour it." The drawing-room was utterly silent. Harrington opened his mouth and shut it again, looking for all the world like a fish hauled onto a riverbank. He had come to corner a green young duke, and instead found himself outmatched by a woman who knew the law of his own scheme better than he did himself. "This is most irregular," he managed at last, snatching up his gloves and his hat. "Most irregular. I shall return when there is a man in the house to deal with." "Do," Clara said sweetly, "and bring your surveyor. I should so enjoy explaining it all to him as well." Harrington stormed out in a fury, and the great doors boomed shut behind him. For a moment, no one moved. Then Mary began, very quietly, to laugh, and Clara crossed to her and took both her hands, and the two of them dissolved into giggles like a pair of schoolgirls who had got away with something grand. Arthur stood behind his pillar, the forgotten tray in his hands, and looked at the woman who had just defended his sister's dignity with nothing but her wit and the cleverness of her own mind, asking nothing in return, not knowing for a moment that the master of the house stood 10 feet away and had heard every word. He had set out to find a woman with a kind heart. He had not dared to hope he might also find one with a mind like a drawn blade. He set the tray down very carefully before his trembling hands could betray him, and slipped away to the stables, knowing that he could not keep his secret very much longer. The conservatory stood at the western end of the house, a great glass house where Arthur's mother had once grown orange trees, and where the late afternoon sun came pouring through the panes to turn the whole place to gold. Clara found him there at golden hour. Mary had gone to rest, worn out by the day, and Arthur had retreated among the potted ferns and the climbing vines with a watering can, glad of a task to keep his restless hands busy. He had not heard Clara come in. When he turned and saw her standing among the green and the gold, her bruised shoulder held a little stiff, watching him with those clever, dark eyes, his heart gave a hard lurch. "I have been thinking, Thomas," she said, "about all the things that do not fit." "My lady?" "There it is again." She stepped closer, slow and deliberate, the way she might approach a skittish horse. "My lady, not miss. You forget yourself when you are tired or moved. Do you know that? Twice now you have spoken to me like a gentleman addressing his equal, and twice you have caught yourself and reached back down for that rough voice you wear like a borrowed coat." Arthur set the watering can down. "I am sure I do not know what you mean." "Then let me lay it out plainly, for I have been counting." She raised one finger. "Your hands. I held your wrist yesterday while you tended my shoulder. There is not a callus on them. No man hauls firewood and shovels stables for a living and keeps the hands of a scholar." A second finger. "Your speech. You say you cannot read, yet I saw you glance at the labels on the seed jars in the potting shed, and your eyes moved along the words. A man who cannot read does not do that."
A third finger. Your bearing. You stand like a man who has never once stepped aside for anyone in his life. And the servants. She paused. The servants, Thomas. I have watched them. The old butler will not meet your eye, but he ducks his head when he passes you, just a little, the way a man does without thinking when he passes someone above his station. The kitchen girls go quiet when you come near. They are all of them keeping a secret, and the secret is you. Arthur stood among the ferns, with the golden light falling all around him, and found he could not draw a full breath. She had taken every careful thread of his disguise and laid them out in a row, and seen at once that they did not weave together. "You have a great imagination, my lady," he said quietly. It was the weakest thing he had ever said in his life. "I have eyes, sir, and a mind."
"And I have spent 4 days now in the company of a stable hand who carries himself like a prince and tends a wounded woman like he was born to command an army." Her voice softened, and beneath the cleverness, Arthur heard something else now, something uncertain and almost afraid. "So I will ask you once more, and I beg you, do not lie to me again. Who are you truly? For I have grown fond of a man named Thomas, and I find I cannot bear it if Thomas is not real." Arthur opened his mouth. Whether he meant to confess it all at last, or spin one final desperate lie, he would never afterward know. For at that moment the conservatory door opened, and the old head butler, Mr. Bellamy, came hurrying in with a folded paper in his hand and his spectacles askew. "Your Grace, forgive me. I would not interrupt, but the rider has come from London, and the magistrate's letter requires your signature this very evening if it is to go back by the same horse, and I—" The old man stopped. He had seen Clara. He understood, in a single, dreadful instant, exactly what he had done, and his weathered face went grey. But it was far too late. The words hung in the golden air of the conservatory like the toll of a great bell, and could not be called back. "Your Grace." Clara did not move. She did not gasp or cry out or stagger. She simply stood very still among the ferns, and Arthur watched the colour drain slowly from her face, as understanding poured into it. Watched the clever mind he so admired fit the final piece into the place it had been reaching toward for days. "Your Grace," she repeated, in a voice gone perfectly flat. "He called you Your Grace." "Clara, there is only one man in this house who would be called that." She looked at him, and the warmth that had been in her eyes since the moment she first held an umbrella over a frightened girl in the rain went out of them like a snuffed candle. "You are not the stable hand. You are the Duke. You are Wexley himself. You have been the Duke this entire time." Old Bellamy was backing from the room, stammering apologies, the letter forgotten in his hand. Arthur scarcely heard him. He could see only Clara and the terrible thing happening in her face as 4 days of kindness curdled into something else entirely. "You let me carry your sister through the rain," she said slowly. "You let me tend her and teach her and defend her to that awful man, and the whole while you stood by in your borrowed leather and your dirt, and you watched. You watched me, like a creature in a cage, like a show put on for your amusement." Her voice cracked at last. "Was it a game? Was I a game?" "No," Arthur said, stepping toward her. "Clara, no, it was never—" But she had already turned and fled the golden room, and Arthur was left standing alone among his mother's ferns, with the whole of his careful, foolish scheme lying shattered at his feet. Arthur found her in the library. She had not fled to her room as he had feared, nor called for her carriage in the dark.
She stood at the tall window with her back to the door, looking out at the last red light dying behind the hills, her arms wrapped about herself as though she were cold. The library was lined floor to ceiling with the books of his father's, and the dying sun came through the glass and lay across the spines in long bands of crimson and gold. He closed the door quietly behind him. "Lady Clara." "You may use your real voice now." She did not turn. "There is no more reason to pretend." Arthur let the rough servant's accent fall away entirely, and when he spoke again, it was in his own voice, refined and low, the voice he had been born to. "Then hear me speak it. My name is Arthur. I am the Duke of Wexley, and every word of what I am about to tell you is true." She said nothing, but she did not leave. "I did not set out to make a fool of you," he said.
"I set out to make a fool of no one but myself, and I have managed that part splendidly." He crossed slowly to the center of the room. "Do you know what it is to be a man with a title and a fortune? Every woman who has ever smiled at me has smiled at the dukedom. Every mother who has praised me has praised my acres. I learned long ago to tell the false from the true by a simple test, and the false always won." "So you played a servant," she said flatly, still facing the window. "To trap an honest woman like a hare in a snare." "To find one. There is a difference, though I grant it is a small one, and I have no right to lean on it." He drew a breath. "But it was never truly about me, Clara. It was about her, about Mary." At last she turned. "My sister has been blind since the fever took her sight at 7 years old," Arthur said, "and from that day to this, I have watched the whole of society treat her as something less than whole. They speak over her head. They pity her to her face and forget her behind her back. The grand ladies who came here hoping to be a duchess would smile at her for exactly as long as I was watching, and the moment they thought themselves unobserved, they would turn away from her as if she were a chair." His voice roughened, and this time it was no disguise. "I swore an oath to myself. I would never bring a wife into this house who did not love Mary as I love her. Not tolerate, not pity, love. And I knew of only one way to learn the truth of a person's heart, and that was to watch them when they believed no one of consequence was watching at all." Clara's arms had loosened from about herself. She was listening now, truly listening, the way she listened to everything. "And then your carriage broke at my gate in the rain," Arthur went on, more quietly. "And before I could so much as form a judgment, you turned your back on your own ruined silk and ran to a frightened girl you had never met, and you held your only umbrella over her head and let yourself be soaked to the bone. And you did not know I was a duke. You did not know I was anyone at all. You thought I was the stable hand, and so you had nothing to gain by it, and you did it anyway." He shook his head slowly. "You passed a test you did not know you were sitting. Every hour of every day since, you have passed it again. And the cruelest part is this. I did not stop watching because I had to. I stopped wanting it to be a test at all. I only wanted to be near you." The red light had faded almost to dark. Neither of them moved to light a candle. "You should have told me," Clara said, but the steel had gone out of her voice, and what was left was only hurt. "You let me believe you were poor. You let me grow fond of a man who did not exist." "He exists," Arthur said. "Thomas was no lie save for his name and his station. Every word he spoke to you, every silence he kept, was mine." The library door opened. Mary stood in the doorway, one hand resting lightly on the frame, her face turned toward the sound of their voices. "I thought I should find you both in here," she said softly. "Clara, please do not be angry with him.
Or, if you must be angry with me as well, for I knew." Clara stared at her. "You knew?" "Of course I knew. He is my brother. I have known since the morning in the rose garden that the stable hand who handed you the linen was Arthur, for I would know his footstep anywhere in the world." Mary came forward, and Arthur guided her gently to a chair. "I let him keep his foolish game, because I understood why he played it. You cannot know, Clara, how it feels to be looked through your whole life long. And then you came, and you handed me a garden through my own fingers, and you described a room until I could see it, and you stood between me and a runaway cart without a thought for yourself. You never once looked through me." Her clouded eyes filled. "He did not test you to mock you.
He tested the world because the world had failed me 100 times. And then you came, and you did not fail." The room was very quiet. Clara looked from the blind girl to the Duke, who had knelt in the mud to tend her shoulder, and Arthur watched the hurt in her face begin, very slowly, to soften into something he hardly dared to name. The carriage was mended by the following evening. Arthur had heard the news from the coachman at midday that the new axle was fitted and the wheel sound, that Lady Clara might depart for her own home whenever she wished. He had thanked the man and walked away with the words sitting like a stone in his chest, for he knew what they meant. She was free to go, and he had given her every reason in the world to take that freedom at first light and never look back. He did not see her all that afternoon. She kept to the company of Mary, the two of them murmuring together in the music room, and Arthur did not intrude. He had done enough intruding upon her, he thought, to last a lifetime. But when the sun had set and the first stars came pricking out over the hills, a kitchen girl brought him a folded note in a fine, clear hand. "The rose garden, after dark. I would speak with the man, not the title. See." Arthur read it 3 times. Then he went up to the room he had not slept in for 3 weeks, the great ducal chamber, and for the first time since the whole foolish business began, he dressed as himself. A dark coat of fine wool, a clean white cravat, boots polished to a shine, no dirt upon his jaw, no borrowed leather, no rough voice waiting on his tongue. When he looked in the glass, he saw the Duke of Wexley looking back, and he found he was almost a stranger to himself. The rose garden was silver in the starlight. The blooms had closed for the night, and the air hung heavy with their scent, and somewhere a nightingale was singing in the dark. Clara was waiting by the old damask rose, the proud grandmother of the garden, the one she had taught Mary to know by the curve of its thorns. She turned as he came down the gravel path, and for a moment they only looked at one another, the Duke in his fine coat and the lady in her traveling cloak, 2 strangers who had somehow come to know each other better in 4 days than most people did in 4 years. "You look every inch the Duke," she said. "I would rather have come as Thomas," he answered, "but I have worn enough lies. You asked to speak to the man, and so here I am, every true part of me. I have nothing left to hide behind." He had brought something with him, cupped carefully in one hand. He held it out to her now. It was a single white rose, and he had spent the better part of an hour in the dark with a paring knife and a steady patience, stripping every thorn from its stem until it was smooth as glass. "I cut the thorns away," he said. "I know it is a small thing, but I have caused you hurt enough, and I wished to give you one rose in all the world that could not." Clara took it. She turned it slowly in her fingers, feeling the stem the way Mary would have, finding it smooth from end to end.
and something moved across her face in the starlight. "Lady Clara," Arthur said, and his voice was not quite steady. "I have no right to ask you for anything. I deceived you, and I am sorry for it, more sorry than I have words to say. So I will not ask for your hand, nor your heart, nor anything you are not freely willing to give. I ask only this. Your carriage is mended, and you may go home in the morning. But I should like your leave to court you honestly, as myself, in the full light of day, with no disguise, and no test, and no game, to call upon you properly, and to win you, slowly, if I can, the way an honest man ought." He paused. "And if I cannot, then I shall let you go, and count myself the better for having known you." The nightingale sang on in the dark.
Clara looked down at the thornless rose in her hand for a long moment, and Arthur held his breath, and the whole of his future seemed to balance upon the silence. Then she lifted her eyes to his, and there was warmth in them again, the warmth he had feared he had lost forever in the conservatory. "You great fool," she said softly. "You cut the thorns from the rose." "I did." "But I liked the thorns, Thomas." She used the name on purpose, and a small smile curved her lips. "A rose without thorns is only half a thing. It was never the smooth parts of you I grew fond of. It was the stubborn man who knelt in the festival mud and scolded me for not saving my own neck. The one who handed a frightened girl a garden through her fingertips. I do not want the polished duke who came down the path tonight. I want the stable hand who watered the ferns and forgot to keep his voice rough." She stepped closer. "So yes, you may court me. On one condition." "Name it. Anything." "That you do not give up the gardens. That now and again, no matter how grand you become, you put on the leather and the dirt and come and help an honest day's work among the roses. For I find I love that man very dearly, and I should not like to lose him." Arthur laughed, a real laugh, the first easy breath he had drawn in weeks. "I swear it, on every thorn in this garden." And under the silver stars, with the nightingale singing and a blind girl listening with a smile from the lit window of the house above, the Duke of Wexley took the hand of the woman who had passed every test she never knew she sat, and the lady who had wanted the man more than the title held tight to the rose he had stripped of all its thorns.